again, just a reminder, we are recording today, and the agenda, we've got a short presentation around the key stats, findings and the case study. We'll take a couple of questions based on those, and then we'll ask to go through the recommendations, and then a more substantive Q&A session where you get the chance to ask about the implications of this report, and some closing remarks, and we'll finish at 1 o'clock. So thanks everybody for joining us, and I'm going to hand over now to Janine Davis, who is of course a panel member and the London regional lead. And Janine is going to take us through the first and second part of the presentation. Janine, over to you, and you have the slides.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Steve. And good afternoon, everyone. Really great to see such a good turnout today. So as Steve shared, today I'm going to be providing an overview of the learning from our panel's thematic review on race, racism, racial bias and safeguarding children. The first slide, as you'll see, is just a vision, an image, I should say, of the various different panel members. Of course, apologies from Annie Hudson, our chair, and Dale Simon, who was a panel representative on the subgroup I led, who had to were unable to attend today. However, as I was the panel lead, I am going to continue with the learning about them. As you'll know, that the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel, we are an independent body, and we are here to identify, commission and oversee reviews where serious child safeguarding incidents have occurred, and to really support you with your learning, to share that learning and to explore what's working, what isn't working, and how we share that learning more nationally as well. And so the learning which we're going to share today, as I touched on, is a thematic review into race. And before we start going into what we identified and what we found, we first just want to be able to provide an overview in terms of why now, why did we decide to, as a panel, to explore this particular issue. And some of this will not necessarily be new to you. However, it's important we share it all of the same. So for those of you who do read our annual report or have read our previous national reviews, there tends to be a reoccurring theme or pattern, particularly around trends related to race, ethnicity and culture, and how that impacts, influences our safeguarding practice, but also how we explore those issues and the extent to which we really grapple and get to grips with those. In addition to that, there is a continued disproportionate representation of children from these particular ethnic backgrounds in our reviews compared to the wider share of the child population. And you can just see some reflections there in the boxes. Black British children overrepresented, 10% in our reviews versus 6%. They make up 6% of the population. Similarly, when we look at this in relation to mixed, multiple ethnic groups of children, 17% in comparison to 7% of the population. And again, continued disproportionate representation when it comes to Asian and Asian British children, 5% in reviews, so an underrepresentation in our reviews in comparison to 12% across the population. But I would also want to share that, you know, beyond that, it was also about acknowledging as a panel, there was, you know, an acknowledgement and an understanding that whilst we could see in reviews that at times there was reference to issues relating to race, potential racial bias, etc., we never really felt that we fully understood or were assured ourselves that safeguarding partnerships were really exploring and scrutinising these issues. And that's why we wanted to undertake this review. Next slide, please. I don't think I can manage the slides. Thank you. So just a brief overview in terms of our, you know, the overall approach and how many reviews we explored in this thematic. So obviously different from a national review where it's much larger. This was a thematic review, really wanting to just explore some of the key themes or to start to explore or question what those were. So in terms of rapid reviews, we explored 40 rapid reviews. And this included, outside of that, 14 local child safeguarding practice reviews, although again, important for us to just acknowledge here that to allow us to just, look at how a rapid review, in terms of key lines of inquiry and how that then translated into the actual learning, what you would expect to see in a local child safeguarding practice review. One of those looked at the same. So the same rapid review and LCSPR explored the same incident. In terms of our timeline, we wanted to ensure that we were exploring issues which were live, almost in the here and now, but also an opportunity to do a bit of a, let's look back to see if there has been, to what extent has there been a change in our journey in terms of how we explore these issues. So our reviews focused on incidents that took place between January 2022 and March 2024. With the most common causes of death, suicide, sudden explained death in infancy, and fatal assault perpetrated by an individual related to the child. And when we undertook this, this thematic review, it was really important that we didn't just focus on a particular cohort or a particular age group. We really wanted to see this across the broad range of ages from 0 to 17 to ensure we were able to really explore those wider challenges and issues. And we also, identified that the most common causes of harm in relation to the 26 reviews related to serious harm instead of death were non-fatal assaults, both perpetrated by family members and or by a perpetrator from an individual unrelated to the child. So there was quite a mix in terms of the various different reviews we were identifying. And I should say, before we move on to the next slide, to ensure that we were really scrutinising, interrogating and interrogating this data and really applying that rigour, we had a subgroup which was chaired by myself, with Jenny Coles and Del Simon, panel members, and then we also had the VKPP providing us with further analysis, analytical support, Sean Brown and Dr. Debbie Alnock to support us with that forensic analysis as well. So for those of you, I'm hoping, have already, reviewed or started at least to explore the findings from the report, you will see that we identified a number of key themes, all of which for us very much spoke to some of the challenges and the insights, the potential opportunities for ways to progress practice around how we safeguard and consider the needs of those children from Black, Asian, as well as mixed heritage backgrounds. And we'll go through these in more detail through the slides, but the key themes were the silence around race and racism. There was a really clear silence, and to the point that when we of course, we have the report called It's Silent, and some of that linked to the fact that there was a real dearth of evidence where we could explicitly see how the voice of children had been brought through into reviews. And therefore, usually when we undertake a review, we'll tend to use a quote or a line from a child, etc. But we couldn't do that because we could not identify a child's voice there. But then when you then intersected that with the fact that we were also talking about this in the context of race, racism, racial bias, there was just this deafening silence, hence why we called the report It's Silent. So we will be exploring the theme around silence more. And the fact that when there was opportunity to explore, race at times, when we did see that coming through in some of the reviews, that there was still a real limited consideration of exploring and scrutinising the potential impact of race and racism in our practice. And, we'll share some examples, but just an obvious one which always comes to mind was when we're reviewing some of the learning, you could identify where practitioners were talking about gender bias and saying, this potentially could be gender bias, or this was a concern for us. So it wasn't that there was a concern or an inability to address or explore bias. It's just that when it was racial bias, that seemed to hinder professional ability to explore the extent to which that could have impeded on our safeguarding practice. And then, of course, the wider impact on Black, Asian, and mixed heritage children. There's another theme, because if there is a silence, if there is a lack of exploration and understanding of racism, then we're led to questioning, well, what does that mean in terms of how we truly understand as a safeguarding network and across our partnerships, how race impacts on the very children we are there to safeguard and support from that racial intersectional experience. And then we have racial bias in decision making and missed opportunities. And there were opportunities again, or examples, I should say, where we could see that there was focus, or at the beginning, key lines of inquiry, or right at the beginning to say, oh, this is something we think we can explore, but we didn't necessarily see that in terms of the whole journey from the learning, in terms of how authors themselves, independent authors, reviewed and considered that learning, all the way to recommendations. And then the next learning for us was around that there really is a need for a structural shift, a change around how we consider these approaches. So I'll just start by providing an overview in terms of the wider learning, as we separated this in terms of the review process and then also actual practice itself. And what as an overarching, collective shared agreement, we know that reviews, play a critical role, not just in identifying, collating and distilling learning, but also that there's an opportunity for us to then think about how factors which we may not necessarily always explicitly focus on or always come to our minds, such as race, the racial or ethnic background of a child, impacts on our practice. And we felt, unfortunately, that's where there are at times a real, a mixed message or a lack of exploration in relation to this issue. So we found that reviews did not consistently explore race at all, or culture. And therefore, it was difficult for us to understand if this was about, was it a lack of an understanding, whether it was from the partnership, whether it was in relation to the terms of reference, was it because actually in terms of the incident itself, it just wasn't seen or considered as an issue. And then there was this silence as well. This is, as I said earlier, this real clear silence, not just in terms of, when we think about race, sometimes it can be, we may have, depending on how we understand it, our own whether lived experience, non-direct experience of that. How do we view it? And when we were thinking about silence, we not only acknowledged that there wasn't just a silence in terms of the interpersonal, so from an individual, which tends to be the focus sometimes when we think about race, as my interaction with another person, but that there was a lack of exploration around how it becomes internalized, the institutional, structural, systemic nature of racism and service and practice responses. So even though when we looked at it through various different lenses, it was really difficult to see how partnerships had really grappled and considered this issue. And when safeguarding partners had explicitly explored or included race or referenced it within their key lines of inquiry, terms of reference, we could see that there was then some positive impact, that there was some type of consideration, this in learning reviews. But even with that being said, as I said on the previous slide, there wasn't that, almost bringing it across and through the entirety of the report or of the review process. So we might see it mentioned, but then we couldn't see how it had been consistently, considered across the review. So we didn't see it show up in the reflections, the questions, the recommendations. It might have just occurred, as we said, right at the beginning. However, we positively, and I think it was important that we were still able to identify any positive or any promising elements of practice. We did see that when you do name it as something which should be a focus or should be a consideration in a term of reference, there was then more willingness or understanding of the importance of including the topic of race in reviews. And then the next stage was around, after looking at the review process, we were then looking at the actual safeguarding itself. And what we found in our sample was that explicit recognition of race, ethnicity, and culture by practitioners was limited. And again, given this is a thematic review, and therefore we're looking at the learning and what we can see, there isn't necessarily opportunity to go out and ask questions to say, well, what does this mean? Or why do we think this was an issue? So we're really very much looking for the reviews to provide as much information as possible, which was quite limiting. So not only did we have the review process not necessarily exploring or considering these issues, actually the detail itself also lacked exploration. So we've seen that, understanding race, ethnicity, and culture in safeguarding practice, of course, we know it is essential, or if we don't know, we should know it is essential for understanding the diverse range of experiences, and also allows us to really think about how we can mitigate or do better to mitigate bias and stereotypes and question when they appear or what that might look like in our safeguarding practice. And in our overall sample, we said that there was a real incomplete understanding of the lived experiences of children, and that therefore we had seen this interesting, on one hand you had understanding of the child in terms of whether it was the risks they may have posed, particularly when looking at an older cohort of children. But when it came to the risk posed to them and their own vulnerabilities and what they're vulnerable to, and then looking at that through a racialized lens, that's where there was a real limitation. From the panel's perspective, there was a real need for services and partnerships to really think about what you see as barriers to engaging with families, and to consider your role. So at times when we were reviewing the learning, there tended to be more focus on these families are disengaging, or maybe it's these particular groups who are more challenging in terms of understanding experience. However, we really wanted to reframe and rethink that and make this about how are you assured that your services are accessible? What processes, what strategies do you have in place in your services to be more responsive, to ensure that you are accessible? Who determines that? Do you know your community and their various needs? How do you link in with services, specialist services who may have a different insight, or may do, a specific type of work with these various different groups, community organizations, etc. How are you engaging with them, so that when we think about barriers which potentially do impact on these particular groups of children and their families, what we weren't sure of and what we were asking for, and what we're asking you to think about, if you're not, and I'm sure you already are, is what does accessibility look like for you, and how are you assuring yourselves that you are responsive to the needs of the communities you are there to support and to safeguard? And to ensure you're not taking, I guess, a universal approach when we know there are, there's no such thing really as a universal child, when we know that there are very much diverse and intersectional experiences which we need to consider and understand. So to give you an example, what we did do is look at a number of reviews, and we provided a bit more of a more kind of forensic magnifying lens on them to explore how bias was considered, to what extent it was even considered as a potential form of stereotyping or bias, etc. How we explored the identity, cultural background of families, and of course the voice of the child and how that was brought to the fore. So in this case study example, the LSCPR, I should say, involved multiple children within a Black British family of African heritage, believed to be under the sole care of their mother. Like most reviews which we review at times where the family has been known prior, we knew that this mother had prior social care involvement in her own earlier life, which had quite a significant negative impact on how she perceived social care professionals, and that didn't come with, for her, the sense of safety. And the family was living in a difficult socioeconomic condition, and there were concerns about the visibility of the children in the home environment. And when we looked at that, what we identified and what we were able to pull out, and this was again without being able to necessarily explore and hear from partnerships or from the reviewing authors who had undertook this review, but very much looking at the learning which is shared with us when a review has been completed. We had seen that there was a real limitation in terms of exploring and capturing the voice of the child, and that professionals had limited direct contact with children, rarely seeing them alone, resulting in a real incomplete understanding of lived experience. And it's arguably, it's fair to say in some way, well, actually, what does that have to do with race or a race, the child's racial background, when actually this is something we see across the board as a panel. We, one of the, I would say, overarching themes we tend to share back when we provide letters to partnerships is that we would have liked to have seen more emphasis or more focus on the voice of the child, or a better understanding of how you understood their experiences. However, when we then looked at this with the wider issues included within this report, it raised further questions, because we knew that the mother, for example, there is a number of references across the report where she was described as an articulate Black woman and was seen to resist engaging with professionals. And we felt, from having our own internal conversations and exploring the lack of exploration at times as to why this language, or why was there framing around this Black woman that she was articulate? Was there an expectation that she wasn't supposed to be articulate? What did that mean? What did that mean in terms of how they engaged with her, how practitioners engaged with this mother? And we felt that the language may have been demonstrative of racial bias and the blaming of mother, and there was quite a lot of focus on the mother. The mother became the core focus throughout the review. She was seen as the person who was almost being quite difficult, and therefore the emphasis and the need to safeguard the children seemed to take center stage, and instead it was the mother who was the core focus throughout. But we did definitely get quite stuck on wanting to really understand why there was this continued referencing throughout about, well, she's an articulate Black woman. And without understanding or exploring it, it leaves you to either misinterpret, or it leaves you to question what that means. And of course, everyone will come up with their own ideas, etc. But it's something we should be, really flagging in terms of the ways in which we frame how we framed this parent, particularly questioning that she was articulate. And then cultural identity. So the family's race and identity were not consistently considered in assessments or decision making. And there was also a disparity among practitioners in terms of whether they considered the race of the family to be significant. And this case study, it was a really interesting one. Right at the beginning, there was a lot of emphasis on, so this was one of the reviews where there had been a focus in the terms of reference, where you started to see an exploration around identity, but then as you started reading the review and got towards the end of that, there was no recommendation, there was no consideration or further in-depth exploration about the extent to which racial bias potentially impacted decision making, or the ways in which professionals considered the needs of this family, but also how they viewed this particular mother, and how bias of her being an articulate Black woman, able to challenge, able to push back, impacted on practitioner confidence to be able to look beyond that and keep their core focus on the safeguarding and welfare of the children.
Thanks, Janine. That's we're moving on to the recommendations now. Just want to pick up on one or two of the comments. Thanks, and just take a breath. That's a lot of information. Thank you for that. There's a number of comments that are asking for recommendations, which of course we're coming to. But just some interesting reflections. Number 7, do you think if the review timescales were increased, it would allow for more time to explore these issues in more depth? That relates to number 3 as well, which is the the issue therefore about the quality of reviews or the quality of the practice the reviewer is looking for? And there's another comment about the timescales. I agree the timescales may impact on being able to engage with families. So is there an issue there that you found?
Well, I think with regards to timescales, and that is a reoccurring question, Aras, so thank you for asking the question. And we do hear the feedback often around timescales and whether or not that can further hinder the ability for partnerships to be able to do a deeper dive into the analysis, particularly in relation to a rapid review. But we also see some really good rapid reviews who are working within the same time constraints, who do focus, who do consider it, who do question it. So I think at times it's difficult to explicitly say it's something to do with the timing and the constraints around that. I think in terms of, and also what that means in terms of the local child safeguarding practice reviews, where of course there's a another a window of time in terms of when you are able to reach out, hear from, if parents, carers, etc., children are able to participate in the learning, as well as how the reviewing author is able to pull the learning together around race. But I think for us, it goes right back to the beginning from the outset, in terms of the commissioning, how we consider it in terms of, our terms of reference, in our key lines of inquiry. It's very difficult to start thinking about an issue at the end. It's how do we actually bake it into our system? And what this also, I think the question we often discuss at panel is, if this is something which isn't necessarily embedded in these reviews or in the rapid reviews or within the local child safeguarding practice reviews, how are you assured that your understanding or focus around issues to do with race, racism, wider systemic inequalities are embedded within your actual practice across the board in your services? Because if they are, then what our hope is, what we should start seeing, what we should be seeing a bit more of, is it's just you're ruling it in before you rule it out, or you're questioning it right at the beginning rather than at the end. So I think at the moment that I would say that's probably our position in terms of how we're considering these issues.
Yeah. Thank you, Janine. There's another topic that's being discussed quite widely in the forum as well, kind of summarised by number 11. How diverse are safeguarding partnerships? Do they reflect their communities and the independent reviewer pool? So there's a number of issues around this. So and particularly 13. How confident can we be when, in many cases, reviewers are not racially monitorized, can competently consider cultural impacts with any credibility? We have recently had a local CSPR to unpick this, and I have little confidence that the white reviewers really understood this, and it felt like they just copied and pasted pages from other people's research into a document with little thinking about how to engage the partnerships on this. And I think 25 as well. Do you think the social fear of saying the wrong thing and the risk of offending people within the different races, ethnicities, and the possible backlash of this are barriers to practitioners and review authors fully exploring potential safeguarding concerns? So what, just some brief response on that. I know it's a big topic, Janine.
I guess so. I guess there are a number of things being touched on. First, the ethnic background of reviewing reviewers, and also the diversity of safeguarding partnerships and the extent to which that can influence the, I guess, quality of the reviews in which are undertaken and which we see. I think from a panel perspective, it's difficult for us to explicitly answer that question because we won't necessarily know the background of the reviewers who always, or the makeup of the partnership. And I also would just want to flag that I think from reviewing, writing, reports myself and my own direct experience, I think, again, it goes back to, at the beginning, where is the opportunity for scrutiny and for challenge? And one of the reflective questions, or a number of the reflective points we have in the report for safeguarding partnerships is around the commissioning of LCSPRs. if we receive a report when it's been reviewed, when it's been signed off by the exec, and there are going to be various different iterations of that. And we do ask ourselves, if there are concerns around racism, how confident do safeguarding partners feel that they can explicitly reference or name racism or bias as an actual issue? And will that be able, would that, come to panel?
Yeah.
So there are those types of challenges, but I would also touch on the points around, as I said, the background of reviewers and how that potentially can hinder practice and our learning. I would slightly push this back and say, as safeguarding partners, you have a responsibility to assure yourselves that when you are commissioning reviews, that you have individuals, not just based on their racial background, because I wouldn't want to assume just because you are from a Black, ethnic, other racialized background, it means that you're always going to be able to explicitly speak about the nuances of these issues, because that isn't always the case. And if we understand how racism and various different issues related to that can also be internalized, that of course can also impact on how we consider issues. So therefore, I think it's bigger than that. It's about how we collectively are willing to lean in to discomfort and willing to think about issues to do with race and have the confidence and permission to say that we can name this in a report if we feel it is an issue. And I think that's for senior leads within and across safeguarding partners to really think about how they are really truly engaging in these types of issues and conversations with their workforce.
Yeah, thank you, Janine. And in addition to that, comment 27, I've seen several reviews recommending unconscious bias training. This term feels out of step with holding us all accountable for racism in practice. And what we hear is needed from children, adults with lived experience of institutionalized and systematic racism. Does the panel take a view on this? I think you've kind of covered that in saying that, the assumption that a diverse review panel does not necessarily bring in all those unconscious biases. But I think that's an interesting perspective from somebody saying unconscious bias training might be helpful.
Yeah, I would say we were very, we had quite a strong position in the as a panel to think about the language we were using in the report. So you'll see that in the report we didn't use the term cultural competence. Unconscious bias in terms of only if it had been referenced by reviewers or by partnerships as an issue, just because when we were seeing that language used, it was really unclear how it was being defined, what was actually meant by it. So we did lean on the concern around how words can, such terms can lean into just almost becoming a buzzword without true understanding. So I think our view for us is, if whatever language you're considering or using, you need to be able to justify that. And how do you do that? And how do you do that in reviews? And can I just say, sorry, I've seen a point and I just feel I want to touch on it. I'm going
Please.
rogue. I'm sorry. The last point, it says, I think it's unrealistic to expect partnerships to accept and name racist practice in a public report. So I think my question is, why then? Why? If racism, if we have an issue with naming a form of harm which potentially can impede on the ways in which we safeguard children, whether it's to do with racism is the core factor or trigger incident which has caused the safeguarding incident, or the fact that racism bias is the thing in which is hindering our safeguarding practice, we need to start thinking about ways in which we can name that. So I would challenge that to say, I think it's unrealistic, but then we need to make it realistic. It's really important, because then I do question, how are we assured that that isn't a safeguarding issue if we're not naming the issue itself?
Very good. And as you were talking, somebody has also responded by saying it's crucial that partnerships name race and racism. I feel it's crucial to set the tone. It's okay to face up to our deficits. So colleague making the same point. Good. A number of questions about, the so what can we do? Amina has referenced the reflected questions in page 30 of the report. And of course, we're now going to come on to the recommendations from the panel. Yes. So why don't we pick those up again? Please keep the the questions coming. The questions and comments will be distilled into a report, so you'll get a response from the panel for some of the topics that we've raised. There'll also be a version of the video which will be edited down to include this discussion and also the presentation from Janine. So back to you, Janine. Thanks.
Thank you. So in relation to our overarching core recommendations, and what we didn't want to do was just to provide a list of things we think you should be doing. I also want to just really focus on panel here as well, is that when we undertook this review, we did not see this as something in isolation from the work we need to do as a panel. And as a panel, we are also on our own journey in terms of how we consider and understand these issues, including the feedback in letters we provide you. And that has also been, I would say, reflected in the report itself, where we have a specific focus on that. So what we thought might be useful, and so far the feedback has been good, but of course really open to hearing any other feedback you feel would be useful for us in terms of how we can support your learning, because we wanted to include reflective questions related to how we can support partnerships to reflect on the reviews, reflect on how they are undertaken, on practice, and that they were there really to prompt your own thinking, and as been able to almost use the report as a tool, as a reflective self-assessment in some way, to think about your current practice and how you again provide assurance around how you consistently think about, act upon issues related to race, racism, and the wider factors. So whilst we're saying recommendation, actually, I just want to be clear, what we really wanted to do was to give you something where you could go away, sit, whether in your teams, in your reflective supervisions, in your conversations or away days, and to review these questions, sit with them, build upon them, scrutinize them, and use that as a really helpful tool to support your thinking and your learning. In relation to the next point, evaluation of current partnership work, where partnerships should carefully evaluate their existing strategies and approaches to safeguarding children from diverse backgrounds. And I guess this all, for me, sits very much within the reflective questions. That's very much a part of what we're asking you to do by providing those questions to you, to think about how and I know I just keep saying the word assured a lot, but it's because I think the question is, I can say, oh, well, we've got all of these different activities in place. We're an anti-racist strategy. We're an anti-racist local authority, or within our services and agencies, we do this. How are you assured it's working? What's your benchmark? How do you test the learning? How are you assured that no matter the background of a child, their experience, there is going to always be that consistent, considered approach to understanding their identities and their intersectional experiences? And then we have the next point, identification of further development needs. And that what we wanted to do, again, with the reflections, reflective questions, was really to a call to action in some way, to ask partnerships to really think about what are the areas which, within your practice, which require further improvement, whether it's in terms of how you commission or undertake reviews, whether it's how you think about not just what you're doing in your agency, but across all agencies. You'll see in the review, we were very specific not to highlight or to say, this agency, children's social care, must do this, or policing, must do this, or health. We really wanted to be clear that what we identified across the reviews reflected challenges, some difficulties across all agencies. And therefore, we wanted to ensure that this was, again, an opportunity to think about our multi-agency response and how you all come together to really think about how do you, provide challenge? How do you provide that scrutiny, that questioning, not just within your agencies, but across agencies? And is that welcomed? Do you feel able to do that? And of course, as it says, of course, the goal is to ensure that safeguarding practice is inclusive and effective. But again, it's how you're able to reflect that in the current systems and mechanisms that you use. So review process, recommendations for safeguarding partnerships. And this was again included within our the body of the review in terms of how we've just pulled out these themes, but also, of course, within the reflective questions themselves, to ensure that review panels have expertise. So this is also linking into some of the questions which have already been raised today around race, ethnicity, and culture. Knowing your your community is, thinking about what specialist services or community-based organisations you may be able to access, or if there are any specialist teams you can also link in with, or other neighbouring boroughs, local areas who are also or have just recently published a report, and you might want to link in with them to see, if there is any other kind of, almost peer support which can be provided. Starting from the assumption that children and families from these backgrounds have experienced racism, to better consider their experiences. Of course, we know that there is no, homogenous experience per se, and we shouldn't homogenize groups based on the fact that they are racialized. However, if we understand the fact that racism very much exists within our society, it will allow us to always think about how racism, not if it exists, but how its existence influences or impacts on the children and families you work with. So really having that as a starting point is crucial. Creating an environment where reviewers feel confident to explore and challenge issues. Because if we really want to have these independent reviews which provide that scrutiny and provide that reflection and interrogation of learning around such issues, then we need to ensure that we are creating a safe environment for reviewing authors to do that work, and to have the permission to be able to name issues when they see them. And of course, to ensure the impact, by doing that in some way does allow then for the impact of race, ethnicity, and culture to be embedded and quality assured in reviewing processes right from the outset, as discussed earlier. And to regularly reflect on and improve your partnerships, practices, and responses to the challenges of race, racism, and bias. And then in terms of practice recommendations, really we're thinking again, look, I want to acknowledge and appreciate that as a panel, given sorry, I can hear background noise. I don't know if everyone's on mute. If you could just mute yourself, please. Sorry. And I would just want to, acknowledge, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge the real, difficulties and challenges many practitioners are working within, and the context we're working within, and that we are really trying our best. And as a panel, we receive reports, we receive information ultimately when things have gone wrong in the system. As a national panel, we very much receive information when something's obviously gone wrong in our systems, and therefore it can feel quite deficit based. But we really did want to put out as much positive practice as possible, but it was really difficult to do that. However, when we were providing these reflective questions for practitioners, we wanted to do that from a place of strength, hence why our first point is around the importance of empowering practitioners and creating the conditions which do that, so that you can have practitioners not only can have the confidence, opportunities to discuss, talk about racism, but very much and identity, and to build your own skills and confidence, and then and how that then moves into meaningful action. So empowering practitioners, and I think that's a call for leadership, for leaders to really think about how do they create safer spaces for practitioners to have the confidence to explore such issues, and to ensure that they have the confidence to do so. Review local strategies in terms of how you currently are addressing or considering these issues, which includes how we commission services, but our overall service design, as I said at the beginning, when we're thinking about the identity and then how we reflect community, has also to be brought into the way in which we think about our services, and how we think about how we meet various different needs. And therefore not just doing it as a bolt-on at the end, but as I said right at the beginning, baking that into our systems. The last point was around support structures. And again, I think for me, all of these link together, how we empower practitioners, how we, what does that mean in terms of the local strategies around how we, design our services, how we commission them, who we commission, but then also how that links to our support structures to ensure that practitioners have the right support and appropriate support in place to recognise, discuss and challenge racism across all of its various different ways in which it presents.
Janine, thanks. Yeah, there's a whole flurry of comments and so on, but the approach of offering these review questions to support away days, supervision, and discussions within the partnerships. And I think your assumption that children and families have experienced racism is, an interesting development. There's a question 36, which is, so who is responsible for widening the pool of reviewers? Is it the department, or perhaps it's something that the independent scrutineers, number 37, somebody suggesting could review progress with recommendations in their LSCP in terms of the diversity of the reviewer pool? Mm-hmm. And I think there's also a theme in there about protected characteristics and how we define Asian, which can often link to South Asian. There are those from the Far East that can feel ignored. And there's another point further down, which is 44. Is there a risk of missing those from other racial, ethnic, cultural backgrounds, not named specifically in the report? We've had a number of reviews involving families from Eastern Europe, South America, and GRT backgrounds. So I don't know if you touched on that, but perhaps pick up on those one or two points.
So I'll work backwards. So with regard to the thematic review, we very much focused on the groups, those children from those particular backgrounds who are not just coming to our attention when there has been a consistent theme throughout. So we wanted to explore that, also acknowledging some of the commonalities between those experiences. As this is a thematic review, and what we have said, obviously right now we are thinking about if and what we decide to do going forward, but this is with a thematic review, we really have quite a smaller focus to explore, and it could be, and I'm sure there will be, where we've similar themes, which of course could be relative to those from Gypsy Roma traveller backgrounds or those from South American, etc. But we explicitly all were in agreement to focus on Black, Asian, and those from mixed heritage backgrounds, because this was the consistent theme coming up. And of course, we are led by the evidence as a panel, and that's very much what informed our decision making. In terms of Asian and any other way in which we use language which can be seen or be assumed to be, homogenous, we do have a breakdown of the data of who we were talking about specifically in the report itself, whether it's East Asian, South Asian, and who comes under that. Of course, where we want to uphold anonymity, there are some instances where we had to be quite careful about how far we were able to go in terms of detail if there are only one or two reviews of a child from a particular background, but completely acknowledge that and in agreement. So that is included in the detail of our methodology, which you can see in the report itself, which has a breakdown of age, ethnic background, neurodiversity, and a wide array of other intersectional experiences.
Yeah. Thank you, Janine. There is an opportunity for anybody to ask a quick question. You can raise your hand in MS Teams, come off camera, and I think Annette, Kerry, you've come off camera. I don't know whether you have a question, or we should pick up on one or two of the other comments in the forum.
No, it's just my camera.
Okay, excellent. So I think one or two other comments. Number 46, reviewers are often asked to have no connection with agencies, not communities, when reviews are taking place. Is there helpful in ensuring that reviews are as close to understanding communities as possible? How do we square that, where we the review panel and the safeguarding partnerships reflect the communities, but not overly biased towards the insight and information those people have in those from those communities?
Well, I guess when we're talking about, just so I'm clear if I'm not understanding that question.
46.
Yeah, I've read it. please,
Yeah.
so if I'm not right, if I'm not making sense, whoever's, please do come in and do let me know. I think the point we were making around ensuring that you are able to speak to, or at least broaden the knowledge of expertise in which you're accessing, where there is a focus or there is a need to have a better understanding about particular ethnic backgrounds, again, whilst not wanting to assume that there is always going to be that homogeneous understanding and all experiences will be the same. I'm not sure where you've got that information from in terms of where reviewers should not have connectivity from. I wouldn't be able to speak on that. I think that's maybe a question you have something to follow up with that particular partnership. In all areas, or most areas, you will have various different services. Where I'm based, we have services, specialist services, which work with Gypsy Roma traveller communities, Orthodox Jewish communities, those from Black, African, Caribbean communities, who we can lean on and say, how do we, this is a theme, what do you think? So I think there is something really important about how I do, I guess, question that, question around bias if you're speaking to people who are potentially, too close to a particular lived experience. I would actually want to reframe that and say you're talking about people with expertise. And if you are in an organisation and you are leading a service which focuses on a particular issue, why would we not be wanting to hear from them? So,
Great. Also a comment there saying, I think holding focus groups with community groups is a good way, and I don't think there is an issue in the reviewer doing this. So some supported there. And thanks, Timothy Reed. He's added in the MS Teams a link to Race, Racism and Safeguarding Children for Government, this report. So I encourage you, if you haven't read that, at least read the recommendations, the review questions, the reflective questions that are posed in the review. We are about out of time. If there are any last minute comments, please add them into the forum. Just to let you know, we will be producing a video recording of this webinar and also a report in the next few days when the panel have had a chance to review the questions, or at least the topics around the questions, and they will create a response which we'll then publish. Don't forget, you can sign up to the newsletter. The details are on the screen now, and these slides will be available as well. If you don't capture it now, then you'll get a copy of the slides. Follow the panel on Twitter, and the mailbox for any email is there as well. I just want to say a big thank you to Janine Davis for stepping up. What you don't know is that one or two of the other panel members were unable to join right at the last minute, so Janine stepped up and did the whole presentation. Fantastic job. I hope that's been a clear set of recommendations and outcomes. Please keep the discussion going, and unless there's anything else, I'll call us to a close. Thank everybody very much for joining us, and we will be back soon with the next national panel webinar.